Cool. I have a very quiet voice, so can you hear me at the back? Yes, okay, good. This is an A to Z of CSS. It was an A to Z, literally every letter of the alphabet. Now it's not, because if you imagine a 20-minute talk cannot really fit 26 letters of the alphabet. So it'll be a handful of properties. I really hope that while they may not be the best properties, they're properties that you've not encountered before, hopefully. So we'll see. You might be wondering the deal with the trust scam. It's just a thing I do. Like, that's me recording the audience at a previous talk, and that's the view that I get, which is kind of cool. And you can put the two side by side. So I might possibly do that again for this conference. Anyway, let's get the obligatory, about me stuff out the way. I've been at Shazam for 5 years, and actually, when I return back to London, from Scotland, I'll be starting a new opportunity, so that's exciting. I'm a Google Developer Expert. I don't like saying the word expert in reference to myself, but that's the name of the program. Google Developer Expert for Web Technologies, which is a program Google runs to recognize contributions made in the community, I guess. If you like this talk, or you like Chrome DevTools related stuff, you can follow me at UMAAR, that's 2 A's, on Twitter, and I try and post useful resources. And finally, I make dev tips, which is a mailing list. You can subscribe, and if you subscribe roughly once a week, I'll send out an email. That email will contain a very short GIF showcasing a workflow, pretty much always in Chrome DevTools, but I plan to expand topics that I cover. And of course, thank you to the organizers. That's a given, but I think they've done a really good job in terms of considering people's needs, and just, thank you to Peter. Cool. So let's actually move on to this talk. This talk is, as mentioned, it's going to be a CSS-related technique for a few letters of the alphabet. Maybe next year I can come back and this will be a 40-minute talk and I can actually cover every letter, but for now it will just be a few. To start out, we'll have a look at after, which is not exactly a property, more of a pseudo-element, which I think most of us have used. You'll use it to add cosmetic content. You don't want to add content that's actually significant to the page for screen readers and so on. It looks a little like this. Sorry, I didn't realize how small that would be. But can I zoom in? No. Okay. Can everyone see that? The screenshot? Okay, cool. So you have your HTML source, you have a word there, and then in CSS you target the after, which is a pseudo-element, and you can add content to it. And I know that's a super easy one, but I just wanted to get us into the habit of what this is. The all, possibly one that you haven't used before, it's literally a property called all, A-L-L, and you can think of it as a hard reset, similar to a reset.css. Browser support is kind of meh, not amazing, but it's still worth knowing about. And the idea is if maybe you have a third-party widget which you don't want to inherit the styles of, you can reset that widget. And that last bullet point that I mentioned where it says, careful, resetting a third-party widget may expose style tags, we'll have a look at what that means. But that's a really interesting consequence, I find. But you'll use it, and it looks a little like this. Oh, that's really small. Can't zoom in. But you'll use it, and it looks like that. And that resets a style to the initial styles. And if you're wondering what initial styles are, there's an actual HTML.css, which is in the Chromium source code, and of course every browser will have their own version. And I think it's got the best comment at the top. It's the default style sheet used to render HTML. I think that's super cool. But it's got all the, the video has some initial styling which is defined there. So if you're curious, you can have a look at that. It's a really interesting style sheet to learn from. So when I say that the all property can reset to the initial styles, this is what I mean. It resets them to the initial styles defined in that HTML.css. And just a few interesting properties. Can anyone guess? Sorry. At the back, can you see this text? You can? Oh, cool. Phew. Can anyone guess why there's a display none for a style block? It's because if you imagine a style block, you embed textual content. If you have that textual content, by default, it'll actually be rendered, because a style block is just a regular HTML element. So it's interesting that the HTML.css actually needs to specify display none to make sure that text isn't visible. And of course, if we go to google.com, you find a style block, while DevTools will clearly tell you, the user agent style sheet has defined that to be display none, you can actually override that and say display block. And on the Google homepage, it looks a little like that, which I don't know, super weird, but I think is interesting. Cool, first letter, it is what it sounds like. It lets you style the first letter of a piece of text. It's a pseudo-element selector. you've got pseudo-classes and pseudo-elements. This is pseudo-element. And it applies itself to generated content. So you know how earlier we covered the after property? Or the after pseudo-element, sorry? Well, if you have a before element with textual content, the first letter will apply itself to that instead. And only a subset of CSS properties can actually be used. And in the past, I know this is probably obvious, but in the past you would probably wrap the first letter in a span tag, just so you can target that in CSS and make the font size a bit bigger or something. Now you can just use that. You can just use that first letter pseudo element, and it looks a little like this in DevTools. So DevTools will very clearly tell you if something is a pseudo element. This threw me off a little. You have to scroll to the bottom, which is kind of tricky. It's not always obvious when pseudo elements are in place or pseudo classes. But if you just scroll to the bottom of the stars pane, you'll find it. The first line, it is exactly the same as first letter, but it's just the first line, and of course that's it's based on the width of that line, no matter what it is at that current state and time. Font display. A font display is a really interesting one, and I would say it's probably my second favorite in this slide deck. I'll show you what my first favorite is in a sec. But font display is really important because it allows us to improve the experience for users. A lot of CSS properties are actually just stuff that helps us. It makes our code cleaner, but it doesn't provide anything new to the user. Font display does, and I'm going to talk about what that is. Font display is all concerned with how a web font is loaded on a page. And I'm not talking about system fonts. This is web fonts specifically. And the property itself is font display, and we'll talk about the values that are applicable. It's Chrome only for now, which is kind of a bummer, but it's, again, you can enhance the experience for a subset of users. And it allows you to employ strategies such as using a fallback font first, and then caching the web font on first page load, but not necessarily using it, but then on subsequent page loads, you can use it, if I explained that well. Now, to understand the values that you can use for the font display property, we have to understand the stages that occur during web font downloading. The 3 stages are font blocking, font swapping, and then possibly font failure if the font failed to download. Font blocking is this period of time where, it's pretty much on page load. The web font isn't in the cache, and the browser's like, okay, let me go fetch that web font, but this can take a few seconds, right? So what it does is it renders an invisible, it's called an invisible fallback font. And the reason for that is because a fallback font is available straight away, but more importantly, it can use the metrics of that font face to kind of place it there. That's why if you load a news website, you've probably seen blank text. And yeah, the whole point of doing this is so when the web font finally does download and it swaps it in, you don't get elements shifting around because suddenly the dimensions of an element have changed. After font block, there's font swap. And font swap is what it sounds like. It's swapping that invisible font face for the web font that's just downloaded. But of course, it's possible that the web font didn't download because it failed for whatever reason. And that brings us on to the final stage, which is font failure. And at this point, a fallback is used. Now, all those 3 stages were necessary to explain because the font display property accepts a few values which hints to the browser what one you want to give a preference to. So if you say font display block, I don't know why the address bar has appeared. If you say font display block, there we go. You'll get a 3-second block period of invisible fonts, and then after, at any stage during that page's lifecycle, that initial page's lifecycle, the browser can swap in the downloaded web font, even if it's 20 seconds down the line, and it can completely swap that in. Now the problem with this is, for a potential 3 seconds, you don't see anything. When I say anything, you don't see text, which is not great. Which is why I think font display swap is tons better, because it doesn't block at all. You don't have that weird 3-second delay. But it's still not great because 20 seconds down the line, the web font could download, and you still get that swap, where it swaps the fallback font, where it swaps the invisible font for this other font, or the fallback font. And the problem with this is that swapping is kind of jarring to the user. So I would kind of advocate to use font display fallback, and it depends on your use case, and it depends on whether this is acceptable, according to your designers and so on. But ideally, you want to have a short swap period and a short block period, where I think it's 100 milliseconds, the browser will wait, and if your web font hasn't downloaded, it's just going to use the fallback font. And this is kind of nice because you're getting content to the user. You're allowing them to read the content a lot quicker. And of course, if your web font fails to download, that's it. Like, it doesn't have a chance to appear on the page. It's only on subsequent page reloads where it can possibly reappear. Here's a little demo. So this is the page when it's loaded. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to reload the page, and I've delayed I've throttled the connection. So if I reload, you can see the font display fallback is there straight away, font display swap there straight away. The web font is about to finish downloading. Is it? Yeah. There we go. And like you can see, for the first few, the web font did indeed like swap in. But you can imagine how for large blocks of text that can be quite a jarring experience to the user. Cool. Houdini, when I was saying font display is my second favorite, Houdini is my first. It's not a property, it's a set of specifications. And the idea is each one of these specifications are designed to extend CSS. Right now, the support is quite limited. I think Chrome has some like experimental support if you enable experimental platform features, but it's still interesting to talk about. So I'm going to cherry pick a few specs, and we're going to discuss what they allow you to do. Cool. So one of these specifications is the properties and values API, where you can register for new properties and like define initial values or sort of, what the default syntax could be. But it's quite a simple and straightforward one. Another really nice one, if you've ever dealt with JavaScript in CSS, you probably had to do a lot of string concatenation and a lot of string manipulation, which is not nice. Having to like remove the pixel value just so you can increment an integer. This actually brings like typed objects, so you can say, hey, like CSS number value, and in this case, z index doesn't take a decimal value, so that it will actually round that down. And in the case of rotation values, there's an actual typed object which is called CSS angle value. So that makes dealing with these things a lot easier, not having to do like string manipulation and concatenation. The layout API is probably the most powerful one because you essentially say, hey, display layout, my custom layout. And you can define my custom layout completely in JavaScript. So you can have these like masonry or whatever layout you want to achieve in JavaScript. You can do that now, assuming that CSS can't do it itself. And it looks like a little like this. I've just copied this example from the spec guidelines. But you call register layout, you provide a layout method, and that layout method gets loads of like interesting information. It gets like geometry information, it gets sort of other custom properties, if there are any, it gets constraints and all sorts. And you can put all your layout logic there. We've got the CSS Paint API, and that's kind of another powerful one. Anywhere where you use a CSS image, you can also call this paint function in CSS. And then just like how you had register layout, you have register paint, and you specify the name, the identifier there. You specify a paint method, which is this block. And again, I've copied this example. What this does is it just draws a circle, but you can see it's quite powerful. You receive it's very low level. You receive a canvas context to draw your bitmap on. You get geometry, you get custom properties. So over here where it says properties.get circle color, that's referencing this. So for theme authors, for plugins, this is very useful. Image rendering is, I don't know, I'm just adding it because it's kind of one of those lesser known ones. I really don't have a use case to ever use this. But it allows you to define the algorithm that the browser uses for upscaling an image. And I found like this QR code example in CodePen. So if you imagine that QR code, that's the default size. If you upscale it, it becomes very blurry, and there's a good chance that won't scan using a QR code reader. And that's the default. If you specify image rendering pixelated, you get that. So this is possibly like the only use case, but or maybe if you're using pixel art, it's useful there. But that's the two side by side. Matches is possibly not. It's useful, but it's maybe not so useful because I guess most of us use preprocessors, and it's essentially selector nesting in SAS or less. Cool. So if we have a look at the very last example, that's what you would do in SAS. You have your compound selectors in the outer scope, then you have your your H1, and in raw CSS it would look something like that. But matches allows you to it's a functional pseudo-class, and you pass all the compound selectors to it, and then you just add the H1, and that's it. So again, you probably, like, I'm guessing most of us use preprocessors, so you might not have a use case for that. Mixed blend mode, I'm not going to go into, but it essentially defines how an element's content should blend with its background. I think there's tons of resources, and I don't really have the time to go into these. And multiply is a cool example, which I can show you. Yeah, so this is all like CSS. I mean, it's using JavaScript to have the glasses follow the mouse cursor. But like, can you see it's using that sort of multiply effect that you might be familiar with in Photoshop? And I think it's super interesting. How do I inspect that? Can people see DevTools? Is that too small? Oh, oops. Okay, can you see it now? Yeah, there's a bunch of interesting properties you can use. I don't know what they do. There's a lot of articles on these, but you can see how like changing that property now renders a different effect. You're defining the blend mode between the two, basically. The not, again, one of those functional pseudo classes. I think most of us know this already. You specify a selector that you want to negate, and one of the interesting use cases is where you have maybe a navigation menu, and between each navigation item, you want a border right to act as a separator, but then you have to sort of cancel it out on the last child. And I always used to do this. And someone on Twitter actually posted like a better way to actually use last child to negate it. So you can say, for every li, which is not the last child, apply that border right. So it's kind of a much more elegant way of doing that. Object fit is a kind of interesting one. And you're defining how the content, typically an image or a video, should react to the width and height of its bounding box. Cool. So we've got this waffle who's, I guess, got intoxicated. But what I want you to pay attention to is the tile, because I'm going to stretch the video, and it's interesting to pay attention to the size of the tiles to see how it's being stretched. So this is without specifying any object fit. But if you say object fit fill, that video stretches, it literally fills, it is what it sounds like, it fills the bounding box. And you can see now that tile is super stretched. It's like you've gone into Photoshop and without holding shift, you've just like dragged, you've resized everything just to fit some arbitrary like bounding box. However, if you set object fit contain, which is probably, I guess it's the property which most people will use, it will expand that video as much as it possibly can, but it will like maintain that aspect ratio. And this is what you'll normally see on YouTube, where you'll get those black bars on the side because that particular YouTube video happened to have a certain aspect ratio. Also, another interesting one is object fit cover, which is, I guess, useful for like background videos, like full screen background videos. And that covers that whole video, so it's touching the top, bottom, left, right of that bounding box, but aspect ratio is still preserved. Cool, running out of time, so I'm going to start skimming through these. We've got the root selector, which is, it's basically the same as saying HTML. It refers to the highest level element in the DOM. And in the past, they didn't really have a use case for it. Now there is a use case, which is CSS custom properties. It totally makes sense to define your custom properties at the HTML level, because then you can, that will cascade downwards, CSS. And yeah, you can have like child elements override that or customize that if they so wish to. Selection is it's a selector to allow you to target the page, the portion of the page which was highlighted. And you can only customize a few things like text shadow and background color. But actually, if you have a long list of elements, you can target each one using emp child, and then sort of very slightly change the hue of that color. And then you can get this kind of interesting rainbow effect. Woohoo! I don't know why I did this. Anyway. Shape outside, I think it's Sarah Swadan. I don't know how to pronounce her second name, but she's like the SVG person. She wrote a super cool article, which when I share out these slides, I'll add a link to it. But it allows you to define these like arbitrary elements, possibly a polygon if you so wish to, for which other content should float around. So here I've got some text, and it's like floating around this like ellipse that I put in this area. Will change. Sorry, I'm starting to rush through these. This is actually the last one. A will change is a hint to the browser. It's not an instruction. I think there was a misconception that's like an instruction. It's just a hint. It's up to the browser what it does with this property. There's a hint to the browser for some possible transformations that may happen to an element, so that it can, if it so wishes to, transform it or like promote it to its own layer. And if you're not familiar with layers, I would advise searching for it. I might add some links to this slide deck actually. But what I've actually done is, can you see this list element? I've applied will change to it. So if I inspect it, now, okay, you can't see this, but DevTools is going really slow and laggy. Okay, I can't show it, but I might share a GIF of it in the mailing list that I spoke about. That's my sneaky hint to you to get you to subscribe. Oh, there it is. Can you see that will change transform? Okay, so if I go to the layers panel, the layers panel indicates to you what elements on the page have actually been promoted to their own layer, and why something will be promoted to its own layer is something I'm not going to go into right now. But you can see if you double click on it, it's taken that piece of DOM which I applied will change to, it's taken that and it has indeed put it into its own layer. And I love the layers panel. It's not used at all, but it's super amazing. Woohoo! Anyway. Yeah, so that's it for now. I do apologize I didn't get to cover every letter of the alphabet, but maybe next year. If you want to follow me on Twitter, that's UMAAR with 2 A's, and that's my website. Thank you very much.